In this crazy political climate, there's one issue that brings everyone together. I'm Tonya Hall, and joining me is Kevin Rupy, partner at Wiley Rein, LLP. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you for having me, Tonya. I'm thrilled to be here.
So, give us a brief summary of your background, your resume, if you will, especially as it relates to the telecom industry.
Sure. So I'm an attorney. I've been practicing telecom law for over 20 years. And during that time, I covered a broad range of issues. So wireless, satellite, traditional phone company regulatory issues, everything ranging from federal funding programs for broadband deployment to pole attachment rates for phone companies to attach to utility telephone poles. But then over the last 8 or so years, or maybe 7 or so years, I became involved in this issue that all of us are very, very familiar with, and it's robocalls. It is the #1 consumer complaint at the FCC and FTC. It is a source of tremendous consumer frustration, understandably, over the years. And interestingly, Wiley Rein is in Washington, D.C., and I do have to say, for everything you're seeing about sort of the political environment here in Washington, it is truly one of the most bipartisan issues in this town right now. It's the #1 priority for the FCC's chairman. Legislation is passed out of both the Senate and House on a overwhelming bipartisan basis. It's an important issue, and there's a lot going on in this space.
So, how does the law define who is and isn't a robocaller?
So that's a great question. So I think one of the challenges with this whole robocall issue is that there is a tendency for individuals to use the robocall term in a fairly generic manner. So they just refer to all robocalls as if they're one and the same. I generally put them into 2 buckets. There are legal robocalls, and within that bucket, you have what I would categorize as both wanted and unwanted robocalls, but they're legal. So if you have a customer relationship with a company, they are allowed under the law, the TCPA, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, to communicate with you via phone. So if you have a commercial relationship with somebody, they can contact you. There are other entities that can call you on the phone, such as charitable organizations, surveys, political robocalls. Those are all governed by the TCPA. And as I said, those categories of calls fall under, both wanted and unwanted. I want to get a notice from my doctor reminding me of an appointment or a school closure. I don't necessarily want to get political robocalls or maybe a marketing call to upsell me on a product. The other bucket is all the illegal stuff. This is you owe money to the IRS, we're coming to arrest you, your credit card's been breached, you need to give us your personal information, your grandchild is under arrest and you need to pay his bail with Amazon and iTunes cards, things like that. So I always think it's really important that when we talk about robocalls, we distinguish between legal and illegal robocalls.
Tell us about this year's efforts underway in the legislative branch of the U.S. government to combat robocalls.
Sure. So as I said earlier, there is a tremendous amount of effort underway, both government and industry. And by government, we've got efforts on the Hill, efforts at the FCC, and then industry is undertaking several efforts as well. And in fact, I look at 2019 as a critical year for robocalls just because there's so much going on. Now, what's happened on the Hill we've seen two pieces of legislation, one that passed out of the Senate and one that passed out of the House, full floor vote. And to my point about the bipartisan nature of this issue, the Senate bill passed by a vote of 97-1, and the House bill passed by 429-3. So this is something that unites elected officials to address robocalls. At a really high level, both of the bills in the House and the Senate address robocalls with respect to something that's called shaken and stir that we can get to and talk about, an implementation of that standard by voice providers and their networks. That standard basically authenticates the phone number that is being displayed in the caller ID. The Senate version, called the Trace Act, is very much focused on robocalls. So it creates sort of a quasi-mandate for implementation of shake and stir. It enhances some of the FCC's enforcement capabilities with respect to illegal robocallers. It creates a industry government working group that will examine criminal enforcement efforts against illegal robocallers, and some other sort of generic and related FCC rulemakings with respect to robocall. The House version, similar thing, except it's a straight mandate on shake and stir implementation by voice providers. It mandates deployment of tools, free tools by voice providers. Both bills permit the blocking of robocalls by voice providers. But the House version goes into aspects of the TCPA that I was talking about previously. So it makes some definitional changes under that statute that are more directed towards the legal robocallers as opposed to the illegal robocallers. What's going to happen with these two bills is that basically they're going to have to go to conference and merge these two bills, get final approval, and presumably signature from the president. So I see it happening.
So you talked about shake and stir several times. Can you just define what that means?
Sure. So shake and stir is an industry standard, and SHAKEN stands for Sharing Asserted Information Using Tokens. STIR stands for Secure Telephony Identity Revisited. And at a really high level, what these two standards do, it's basically a network standard that voice providers would deploy in their networks that enables the originating voice provider and the terminating voice provider to authenticate the caller ID that's being displayed. And the way it works is through basically encrypted tokens. So the originating voice provider that puts that call onto the network will authenticate and attest to the validity of the caller ID that it is presenting with that particular call. And for any phone call, I'm a Verizon subscriber. Let's assume, Tonya, that you're a T-Mobile subscriber out in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And if I make a call to you, that call may very well transit 3, 4, maybe 5 networks before it terminates on your end. And what SHAKEN does, it basically builds a network process whereby the token associated with that call and that caller ID is passed to each downstream provider so that they too can authenticate that caller ID information as it passes along through the network.
All right, Kevin, what are the next legal and regulatory milestones on the horizon intended to reduce robocalls?
So there is a lot going on. 2019 has been an extremely busy year for regulators and legislators. So we talked about what's happening on the Hill. One of the recent developments at the FCC the agency back in, I think it was June, adopted what's called a declaratory ruling and a further notice of proposed rulemaking. And what that declaratory ruling does, it's basically a decision by the commission where they look at their existing statutory authority and they say, look, our interpretation under the FCC's existing statutory framework, we are declaring that voice providers can provide what are called opt-out call blocking tools to consumers. And this is a huge game changer because previously, back in 2017, the FCC set up statutory authority or regulatory authority for carriers to block 4 very discrete aspects of calls. And these were basically calls that had invalid caller ID numbers in there. So, you know, all ones or all zeros or all twos, unallocated phone numbers. So numbers that hadn't been distributed to a voice provider to assign, and unassigned phone numbers, as well as something called do not originate, where the owner of the phone number says, block any call showing my caller ID. Those are really narrow categories of the billions of robocalls that are transiting the network. What the FCC's declaratory ruling said was basically, look, voice providers can deploy blocking tools, permissive. They don't have to, but they can. They can deploy voice block or call blocking services and apps to their customers on an opt-out basis, meaning that, you know, if you're a customer, you don't have to sign up for anything. You don't have to log in to turn it on. It's just automatically turned on. And those calls will, you know, block robocalls using what the FCC calls reasonable analytics. So there are a number of things that can go into making a determination as to whether a call is legal or illegal. But that declaratory ruling was a green light for voice providers. The rulemaking is a separate proceeding, but that basically asks a lot of questions about how the FCC should set up rules for this blocking framework it's putting in. Both the declaratory ruling and the FMPRM note that voice providers cannot block critical communications. So these are calls from public safety entities, for example. They can't block those calls. In the FMPRM, the FCC kind of asks, what's the best way to do that? Should we set up a central list? Should we have voice providers maintain their own lists? How do we make sure it's accurate? There's also a discussion about something called a safe harbor. And what that deals with is basically setting up a framework whereby if a voice provider provides opt-out blocking tools to its subscribers, if they inadvertently block a legal call, they don't want to be held civilly liable for blocking that call. So the FCC basically has to figure out what the scope of that safe harbor is, such that, you know, so long as a voice provider is blocking those calls consistent with that framework, they would not be liable for the inadvertent blocking of a legal call.
Kevin Rupy, partner at Wiley Rein LLP. If somebody wants to connect with you, Kevin, how can they do that?
I would encourage them to go to our firm's website, wileyrein.com, WILEYREIN.com, and you can find my contact information there.
Sounds good. Thanks again for your time, Kevin. And if you guys want to find more of my interviews, you can do that right here or go to tonyahall.net. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, Tonya.